everybody, thank you so much for joining. We are so privileged to have our colleague and friend, Professor Megan Doney. We are looking forward so much to your talk, Megan, but I first want to say something about you, if you don't mind. So Megan Doney is a writer and English professor in Virginia. Her first book, Unarmed, an American Educator's Memoir, won the 2024 Washington Writers Publishing House Nonfiction Prize and was released in October 2024. Her work has been published in Illinois Review, New Limestone Review, Rappahannock Review, Creative Nonfiction, Earth and Altar, and Inside Higher Ed, as well as in the anthologies Allergeny and If I Don't Make It, I Love You, Survivors in the Aftermath of School Shootings. Megan has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize, Best of the Net, and Best American Essays. She was a Fulbright Scholar in South Africa in 2007 and returned here in 2015 to study reconciliation and violence. Megan earned an MFA from Lesley University. Megan's talk is about firearm violence in the United States, which is frequently framed as a public health issue in order to dampen the volatility that characterizes it in a political and legislative framework. Megan states, however, I, as a professor, writer, and survivor of a school shooting, wish to reframe it as a justice issue, one that cannot be healed through individual efforts and resilience, but that demands large-scale political and cultural commitment to non-violence. Inspired and informed by the successes and limitations of South Africa's truth and reconciliation process, my memoir offers the singular perspective of an educator survivor and attempts to bear public witness to not just the event, but the aftermath of gun violence in a culture that adamantly refuses to act. It is a great honor now to hand over to Megan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's such a kind introduction. I mentioned to Hunter and Marisa that we have just switched over to Teams here at my institution, so I'm still learning everything, and so I hope that I get it. I hope that I get it all right. So I just want to say thank you again for this invitation. And I spent the 2015-2016 academic year at UFS, and it was such a formative and important event. That was a very eventful year on campus in my creative and scholarly life, and I just miss the place and all of you very, very much. So I just want to offer as well a little bit of context about the kind of institution where I teach. So in the United States, community colleges are public institutions that serve students who may aspire to attend a university like UFS. So some may attend for 2 years in order to complete some of their early baccalaureate work, their university level coursework, and then they will transfer to a 4-year university for their last 2 years. But we also have other students who come for a short-term certificate in something like instrumentation or office administration and so forth. So probably a TVET is the closest parallel or so. And I teach academic writing, women's literature, and creative writing, among other things. I want to just offer a couple of other acknowledgments, I think, of some of my own limitations here. Alexandra Fuller is a white Zimbabwean writer who lives in the United States now, and her work has been very influential to me from a craft perspective. But in one of her books, she writes, "How you see a country depends on whether you are driving through it or live in it. How you see a country depends on whether you can leave it if you have to." And so I am approaching this. I am a white United States citizen. My husband is South African. I have spent much more time in South Africa than the average American citizen, but my perspectives are obviously constrained by that, outsider status. And I just want to be very clear that I'm not attempting to equate American gun violence with apartheid and genocide or colonialism. And my intent is not to dim or diminish any of the realities of life in South Africa, but I do want to investigate the ways that embedded cultural violence echoes down through generations, how perceptions of freedom, trauma, and safety inform restitution and justice practices, and how governments can hinder or foster genuine progress. And in that regard, I do believe that the United States can learn a lot from South Africa. So I will, is the PowerPoint, is this visible to everyone? Is this okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yes,
Maggie.
okay. All right. So I would like to, let me just, we'll start off briefly with this quotation. So this is from the columnist Jamel Bowie, writing for the New York Times in 2023. And he wrote, "Society itself cannot work in a situation where guns proliferate to be used by anyone with the urge or inclination to kill. We cannot live when we fear violent death. In such a condition, there is hardly any society at all. And if there's freedom, it is the false freedom of the state of nature in which our weapons are always pointed and our eyes are fixed upon one another." And I think that is a helpful and revealing encapsulation of the prevalence of firearms in the United States and the sort of constant implied threat of violence that such widespread use and carry of firearms creates for us. So I want to also share just a few slides with some information about the breadth of the problem in the United States, as well as some of the inconsistencies of legislation as well. And these are from the Giffords.org website, which is an advocacy group founded after Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords was shot in the head in 2011 in a mass shooting. So just as to emphasize that a member of Congress was gravely injured in a mass shooting in her home state of Arizona. So you can see that some of these numbers tell us that 125 Americans are killed with a gun every day. That means that there are nearly 46,000 a year. The majority are suicides. 40% are homicides. The smaller percentages are shootings by police and unintentional. There are an estimated 393 million guns in circulation in the United States. That is more guns than people, and a higher rate of firearm violence than any other high-income country. And the estimated annual cost of firearm violence in the United States is $557 billion. And that includes money spent on lawsuits, on medical expenses. It's just a massive amount of money as well. Just a few other elements of this problem. According to the Mapping Police Violence database, law enforcement officers fatally shot more than 1,400 Black Americans over the last 5 years, including at least 130 who were completely unarmed. Additionally, in the realm of intimate partner violence, every year more than 700 American women are shot to death by intimate partners, roughly one every 12 hours. and that when an abuser has access to firearms, his partner is 5 times more likely to be killed. And they are used to, guns are used to commit more than half of all intimate partner homicides in the United States. We also have a very haphazard legal framework for regulations around firearms. So offering this just as an example. So each state can make its own laws regarding child access prevention and storage of firearms. So you can see that in the state of Illinois, for example, in the top left corner, that state generally makes it unlawful for a person to store or leave their firearm unlocked and accessible to a minor under the age of 14. But in the lower right corner in Louisiana, Louisiana has no law that prohibits allowing a child access to firearms or that requires safe storage of firearms. So you can see that from just moving from state to state, the regulations are so different. There's so little consistency from place to place. And the same is true when it comes to having a history of domestic violence and firearms as well. So you can see, for example, in the center of the top row, that in Alaska has no law prohibiting individuals convicted of domestic violence misdemeanors from purchasing or possessing firearms or ammunition. Below that, however, in California has enacted some of the nation's strongest laws to protect victims of domestic violence from firearms, although implementation gaps remain. So again, I want to offer that again as as some evidence of how haphazard and how patchwork some of these laws really are. So I'd like to also share this quotation from the writer Rebecca Solnit, and she had an essay and then an essay collection called Men Explain Things to Me go viral a couple of years ago. But she included this line in her book, that to tell a story and to have it and the teller recognized and respected is still one of the best methods we have of overcoming trauma. And there's another quotation that has really resonated with me, and it is from a book called The Evil Hours, a biography of post-traumatic stress disorder that I read very closely and annotated in my office at UFS. And the writer says, part of trauma's corrosive power lies in its ability to destroy narrative, and stories, written and spoken, have tremendous healing power for both the teller and the listener. So I'm going to start off speaking a little bit about testimony. And just as I was driving into my office this morning, it occurred to me that the book that I wound up writing and having published this past year is, I think, its own kind of testimony, perhaps its own form of testimony. So when I was first planning my sabbatical at UFS, I was most interested in how the lessons of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission might inform a cultural shift in narratives around gun violence in the United States. And that phrase thoughts and prayers has become, just going to pause here for a second and kind of stop sharing that. But that phrase thoughts and prayers has become a real cliche after every public mass shooting in particular. And it becomes proof, that no lawmaker is going to take legitimate action. Oop. I'm sorry. Sorry. Okay, sorry about that. I'm still figuring, like I said, I'm figuring this out still. Okay. All right. And so I wondered if there were public broadcast testimonies from victims, from medical examiners, from law enforcement, from parents and families of the murdered, from perhaps even perpetrators, from the families of those who died by suicide, from military, from clergy. Would we be able to change? Would this country actually experience a greater awareness of the toll that this kind of violence takes on us? And would we commit to making sure that there would be an end to this devastation? And so the book Country of My Skull, which I know you're all familiar with, was another touchstone text for me as I studied and worked through a lot of my own, my own thinking as well. And I'd like to share this quotation from Anki Kroch, that there are three kinds of memory loss. The first is voluntary. You change your memory because you are under threat, because you cannot bear to live with the reality. The second is involuntary, something so traumatic that it rips a hole in your memory and you cannot remember the incident or what happened just before and after it. But there's also a third kind of memory loss, and that occurs when you testify in public. Oral narratives, the academics say, are driven by remembered core phrases and images that carry the distillation of the entire story. And though the narratives may differ in the information they bear, the core elements stay the same. Because of these narratives, people can no longer indulge in their separate dynasties of denial. So I believed that it might be possible that if the American public heard stories from all of the people who had suffered from firearm violence, that maybe we would stop indulging in that dynasty of denial. This is another line from an excellent book called Aftermath, Violence and the Remaking of the Self. And the writer, Susan, I'm not sure if how to pronounce her surname, I'll use Brisson. In order to construct self-narratives, we need not only the words with which to tell our stories, but also an audience able and willing to hear us and understand our words as we intend them. This aspect of remaking a self in the aftermath of trauma highlights the dependency of the self on others and helps to explain why it is so difficult for survivors to recover when others are unwilling to listen to what they have endured. And this line made me think so much about not just the aspect of testimony, of offering witness, but the importance of having a receptive audience, people who can actually hear. And I have thought a lot about the differences between factual truth and narrative truth, and how things might be experienced in the memory and in the body and through a sense of temporal disruption. And in the context of the United States, I think that both of those elements of truth are necessary, the factual, but also the narrative, to be able to tell the story, not just of what has happened, but also how it reverberates through one's consciousness and alters that consciousness and conscience as well. So I did not understand at the beginning how deeply tied justice would be to healing and recovery. And so to transition to my next sort of section about justice, I'd like to play for you a piece of testimony from a child named Mia Cerillo. Mia was one of the victims of the Uvalde, Texas mass shooting at her primary school. This testimony was pre-recorded, and then it was played to a congressional committee. So I'm just going to go ahead and play this excerpt from Mia, and I'll put on the captioning as well because she's.
Sorry, Megan.
Sorry?
You've stopped sharing your screen, by the way.
Oh, I'm so, gosh. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Share. Good?
Yes.
Okay, so sorry. Thank you for the notice. I apologize again. I'm still figuring out how to do all of this, so. Okay. So I'm just going to play this this excerpt from Mia, and like I said, I will put the captions on as well.
My name is Sevilla, and I go to Rock Elementary. I was watching a movie, and then she got an email, and then she went to go lock the door, and he was in the hallway, and they made eye contact, and then she went back in the room and told us go hide, and then we went to go hide behind my teacher's desk and behind the backpacks, and then he shot the little window, and then he went to the other classroom, and then he went, there's a door between our classrooms, and he went to there and shot my teacher and told my teacher goodnight and shot her in the head. And then he shot some of my classmates and the whiteboard. When I went to the backpacks, he shot my friend that was next to me, and I thought he was gonna come back to the room, so I grabbed the blood and put it all over me. And
what did you do then when you put the blood on yourself?
I stayed quiet, and then I got my teacher's phone and called 911.
What did you tell 911?
I told her that we need help, and to send the police in our classroom.
If there was something that you want people to know about that day and about you, right? Or things that you want different, what would it be?
To have security.
Do you feel safe at school? Why not?
I don't want it to happen again.
And you think it's gonna happen again?
This follow-up was published in a newspaper in Colorado that on Wednesday, 11-year-old Mia Cerillo, a survivor of the Uvalde school shooting, who smeared herself with a classmate's blood and played dead in order to escape the gunman, will testify to the House Oversight Committee. Read that sentence again and ask yourself why. We are a nation reduced to public shaming from traumatized children in order to wring an ounce of compassion and human decency from Republicans who value guns over human lives. We are a country where 11-year-olds who survive mass shootings have to recount their trauma in public because this party fundamentally doesn't give a damn about gun violence. And that, that video is so impossible to watch. And I look at her and I think of what is asked of that child, that she offer that testimony to adults, asking them to not let this happen again. And I think about these lessons that I have learned and the things that I have studied about the necessity of having a receptive audience who will hear her and do something about what has happened to her. So I'm going to shift a little bit into talking about justice and what that might mean. So I watched one of the previous seminars in this series with the Canadian scholar Susie O'Brien, and I was really struck by one of her comments about resilience. And she was speaking about colonialism, but that idea of resilience in the context of firearm violence has also preoccupied me. And I have had people say to me, when they read my writing about the shooting, I have been praised for my resilience, and I know that these children have as well. But demanding resilience without also offering justice is, I think, its own kind of violence. It isn't resilience when you have no other choice, writes Emily Rapp Black, who is another one of my touchstone authors. And real justice is change, a commitment to make sure that something like that never happens again. And I'm returning now to Country of My Skull, where Ankie Krach writes about her Afrikaner heritage as a reporter for the TRC, and she reflected, what I have in common with them, with the perpetrators, is a culture. And part of that culture over decades hatched the abominations for which they are responsible. And in a sense, it is not these men, but a culture that is asking for amnesty. And I could so easily substitute American for Afrikaner in that context. And I think about the ways in which the American people ask for amnesty after every wounding and after every massacre, never once engaging in the real action that could stop it. And I think that this has to have been one of the most painful and prolonged elements of my healing process. The one thing that I always wanted was that no other educator should have to create a document called post-shooting lesson plans. But I have failed at that, and my culture has failed at that as well. And there is a wonderful interview with Dr. Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela in the New York Times in 2020, where she writes, the language of reconciliation is limited when used in isolation from other issues of social justice. So I did not, before coming to UFS, really understand the material limitations of the TRC and its aftermath. And it has certainly, I think, I see now, I think, the ways in which there were great successes and that it was a transformative event, but that there were also shortcomings in the end. And to build on Mia's story, when Mia was a child there in 2022, 19 children between the ages of 9 and 10, and 2 educators were murdered. And in the aftermath, there was a glimmer. The Congress passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and it implemented several changes to the mental health system, school safety programs, and gun control laws. And it was the first federal gun control legislation enacted in 28 years. However, earlier this month, on May 1st, the Trump administration said that it would stop paying out $1 billion in federal grants that school districts across the country have been using to hire mental health professionals, including counselors and social workers. These grants were part of that Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. That bill passed in the aftermath of this massacre in Uvalde, and it poured federal dollars into schools to address rising concerns about a student mental health crisis. So when this happens, what does this communicate to Mia and the other children who have had to tell their story? What justice does this offer to those children and educators and their families? And just as an additional devastating aside, the husband of one of the teachers who was killed in this mass shooting dropped dead of a heart attack the day after the shooting. The day after his wife was killed in her classroom, he also died from a broken heart and the shock. So when a government declares that guns are not the problem, but mental health is, and then removes the resources to support mental health, it has also removed itself from responsibility and culpability, as though the burden of healing and resilience is only on isolated communities and individuals. And so refusing to acknowledge the part that governments and culture play in that rupture only deepens the rupture. I was also thinking the other day of in January of 2023, I started to see a therapist who specializes in EMDR. And this is a kind of trauma reprocessing therapy that's become more popular in this country, at least. And it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And so the idea is that you can dampen traumatic memory through directed eye movement, as well as other repetitive physical movements like tapping. And the therapist asked me, so on a scale of 1 to 10, how high is your distress? And this was at a point where my distress was quite high. And I said, it's probably a 9 right now. And she said, so the point is to get you from a 9 to a 2, because it's not healthy for you to be walking around at a stress level of 9 all the time. And I said, I think that the problem isn't that I am at a 9 and I need to be at a 2. The problem is that I live in a country that's at a 2 and it needs to be at a 9. The country that I live in has to be more alarmed at this than it is. And she didn't really say anything to that. She kind of just sort of stared at me for a minute. And I'm not sharing this story to imply that as some kind of gotcha that, oh, I shut the therapist up for a moment, but just to highlight, I think that there has to be a cultural response that, recovery from incidents like this cannot only be the responsibility of individuals. And I can recover, from the mere memory of my shooting, but the aftermath is what becomes so painful that it just continues to happen over and over and over again. And that makes reconciliation almost impossible. So, and this brings me to sort of the latter third of my talk. And I want to pose first the question, what kind of a nation allows this to happen? I think that question emerges as a kind of rhetorical scream into the abyss in the aftermath of firearm violence. It's an expression of despair more than a genuine interrogative. But I do think that it must be answered. It cannot be just a rhetorical question, because what kind of a nation allows this to happen is becoming a matter of life and death. I'd like to share this quotation as well from the Martin Prechtel and his book, The Smell of Rain on Dust. The only nations capable of the true art of grief, grieving their mistakes and the deeply felt losses they have endured or have caused to happen, can say they are not pools of emotional stagnation dressed up in the spoils of ungrieved wars disguised as good business, heaping their unwept tears upon the poor and struggling as the currency of poverty. And it is in this regard, the thinking about the true art of grief and grieving their mistakes and the losses they have endured and caused to happen, that I perceive such a greater evolution on South Africa's part than on the United States. And a totemic value of American culture is progress, forward momentum. And the idea that one might look back and learn from mistakes is frequently perceived at the highest levels as an act of weakness, and that reflection is for the insecure and the uncertain, not the strong. And we are seeing that empty value exemplified in the president right now and in all of his leadership. And even to take that a step further, it is, I think, characteristic of a broader disdain for learning in general, because what is learning if not an ability to reflect on the past, to change the present and the future? And this amnesia is playing out in other arenas too. The current American Secretary of Health and Human Services has been, rescinding vaccine research and availability. So the problem isn't polio or measles. The problem is the vaccine for polio or measles. And so this regressive ethos is taking root at just the highest levels. I'd like to share just a paragraph from my book, and it's a reflection on my first visit to the Apartheid Museum. And so it starts, the word museum comes from the Greek museon, a place for the muses, minor goddesses of the arts. There were 9 of them, the daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory. This is apt, I think, that the word for a repository of the past is, like its namesakes, a descendant of remembrance. A museum shows what we believe is beautiful, dreadful, worth memorializing. That South Africa constructed such a monument to its recent past so soon after the transition to democracy shocked me. Its existence was urgent, and there was nothing sloppy or haphazard about it. It is thorough, accurate, emotionally intense. The entire month, I had sensed a courage in South Africa that was lacking in the United States. The Apartheid Museum seemed to me a monument to that recent past and to the leaders who risked everything for liberation. The people decided that it was worth remembering, and amnesia was not a prerequisite for progress. In contrast, and this also just happened earlier in the month, an exhibit honoring victims of gun violence was taken down at the ATF headquarters. That's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. So you can see that there was a wall exhibiting the portraits of 120 people killed in gun violence incidents. A digital kiosk with biographies of each person was also part of the exhibit, and that was also taken down. So that just happened at the beginning of this. That just happened at the beginning of this month. The Trump administration has also rescinded over $800 million in grants to local gun violence prevention and crime reduction programs, also cutting funding for domestic violence assistance and drug addiction intervention programs. So I am thinking about coming to the end of my presentation here. A short article in a sociological journal by the researcher Jennifer Dawn Carlson. And the title of this short piece was From a Society of Survivors to a Survivor Society, Examining Gun Trauma in the United States. And she writes that gun trauma reveals that what uniquely distinguishes the United States is not simply the prevalence of gun violence, but also the indifference, insensitivity, and striking lack of support that survivors often encounter as they navigate the afterlife of gun violence. And most of the social response rests on the presumption that gun violence is fundamentally an individual loss. Many have described the political system, particularly its unwillingness to proactively address gun violence, as profoundly and personally distressing, depressing, and demoralizing. And several have explained how the media, whether by distorting their words, misrepresenting facts surrounding their case, or simply reporting on gun violence as yet another headline story, have exacerbated the impact of the gun violence they have directly experienced. And she winds up by saying that gun violence represents not just an individual pain, but also to the extent that we share the society in which we live, love, and heal, a loss for all of us. The gun violence survivors I interviewed wanted policies that would prevent what happened to them from happening to anyone else. The act of gun violence itself, and also the bewildering aftermath of it. In other words, they wanted prevention, and they also wanted the kinds of support that heal people and places. That is structural reform as well as therapeutic support. And you can see that her footnote is there as well. So I am going to stop sharing because that is my last slide there. So where are we? Where are we winding up here? And what have I learned? So there's one last quotation that I'd like to end with, and it does come from, again, the book, The Evil Hours, a biography of post-traumatic stress disorder. And David Morris writes, "The impulse to wander, to leave the awful past behind and kill time in a strange place, is written across the lives of so many survivors that it could easily stand as a literary genre all its own. It is, in essence, a form of resurrection." And I had to leave the United States in order to see that clearly. And I want to emphasize again that I think South Africa and UFS gave me that resurrection. It gave me that opportunity to see this, to see my own country in such a different way. Healing and recovery from violence like this requires justice from the society in which the people live. This insistently individualized and atomized nature of the American character makes that nearly impossible. And I think that until freedom is disentangled from the freedom to threaten violence, we do not have real freedom. There is no freedom to simply move through your day without the threat of this in your supermarket, in your synagogue, in your church, at your concert, in your school. That is not real. That is not real freedom. So I think that's all that I have. So I just welcome again. Thank you so much for your interest and attention, and any thoughts or questions. I would be thrilled to. I would welcome anything. So,
Megan, thank you so much for this brilliant expose of the mortifying realities of living in a country that refuses to address the horrors of gun violence. I found it most disturbing, but also most enlightening. Thank you so much. I'm now going to open the floor for questions, please. I see there's something from Eileen. Let me just see. Can you see the comments?
I can see in the chat.
Yes, please. I'll just read it. Megan, don't you feel the problem of gun violence is an accepted way of life in the US, which people actively don't want to change? Perhaps using activism or public engagement to change the status quo would not go far. America loves its guns and the Second Amendment, and it's willing to accept ghastly events such as school shootings in exchange for its right to bear arms. The rate of gun violence appears to be at an unacceptable level. Contrast this with the UK and Australia, which basically eliminated gun violence simply because the collective will was there, unlike in the USA.
Yes. I think that we have to face that. That has been a very painful realization, that I suspect that there are people for whom this is acceptable. And that that leaves others of us in a very difficult place, because what do I do with that? What rhetorical strategy can I offer to change someone's mind when the Second Amendment is taken as though it is, as almost as though it is a religious expression of how life should be lived? I think I suspect that it would be so difficult for people in other parts of the world to understand how deeply entwined religious rhetoric is with firearms in this country. It daily, almost daily, I see cars with a sticker on the back that reads, God, guns, and guts made America great. That this is all tied up in the American identity, and it's celebratory. It's not something shameful. And I genuinely don't know what to do with that mentality. I really don't. And I write in my book about actually about the UK and how, I was a university student studying in Scotland in 1996 when the Dunblane primary school massacre occurred. And I remember so clearly the headlines and the grief from the other students, I lived with. And I see that the UK decided, nope, never again, not letting that happen. And so I know what's possible. I know what's possible in other places. So to say that it can't happen here, that's a matter of will. It's a choice. This is a choice that this country has made. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Thanks, Megan. My apologies.
Yeah.
That was not a question from Eileen.
Okay.
It was a question from our colleague in Klantla. I see
Yeah.
Layla has her hand up. Please, Layla. I think you may be muted.
I think you're muted.
Okay, she's
Okay.
going to type. The
Okay.
next hand is Tinus's.
Should I ask my question or should I wait for Layla
Yeah,
to finish
no.
typing?
No, please
That's a
go
question
ahead,
for Marisa.
Tinus. Please do go ahead.
Okay, go ahead. Fine. So I'm a little conflicted because I had a question ready, and then Megan, you sort of answered it and sort of not. So I'm gonna try and make some sense now. One thing that I get confused about is that I often see news reports that actually suggest that there is broad-based support across party lines in America for things like universal background checks, or for such a thing as a strict, centralized, federal-backed law around gun ownership that would override the states. But then I hear you say, you talk about the prevalence of these stickers, and I think, am I just wrong? Is it true that America as a society has, for the most part, let's say 51% of America has decided we love our guns, we want nobody taking our guns away? Or is it the case that maybe 60% of the electorate would actually welcome strict gun control, but the problem is really a kind of blockage at Congress, Senate, and the president? I'm not sure where the disruption lies. And I need to have you answer that question first, because that will either make my next question important or completely invalid. So please answer that question.
Okay. So yes, you are correct in that surveys and general research indicates broad population level support for these, what most of us would call a common sense measure, like universal background checks. But that often fails at the congressional level. So again, the rules around background checks are so haphazard. If you purchase a firearm from a federally licensed firearm dealer, they are required to perform a background check. But because so many states also allow interpersonal transfers, you're just giving it to someone else, or you're putting an ad in the paper, you know, I have this for sale. You know, one of the first gun shows that I went to, you know, that I visited as part of the, you know, the research for my book, included quite a lot of federally licensed dealers who can perform a background check on the spot for someone who wants to purchase a firearm. But there are also private sellers who were selling AR-15s off of a table in a civic center, and I could have written them a check for $1,700 and walked out with that weapon, and that would have been perfectly legal. So there is wide population level support for this, but it gets hung up on at the national level. So
Okay, then just a quick comment / question you can return to before you pay attention to Layla, who technically was ahead of me. I'm being a very traditional patriarchal man by taking up a space set aside for women. Sorry. So, but it sounds to me like to a significant degree, the problem comes down less to the general US population and less to a broader American culture than it comes down to problems at Congress, Senate, and the president. So this is less a US cultural problem and more to do with the way that lobbyists and interest groups have turned the democracy into a kleptocracy. You know, so that's a thought. You can answer or comment to it, answer the question or comment on it now, or pay attention to Layla first.
Yeah. That I think that there's definitely, you know, there's definitely truth to that. It's also so difficult, I think, to try to explain the way that representatives in Congress are elected and how they keep their seats for so long. And so, you know, there's a whole other issue that here is called gerrymandering, and it's about how districts are drawn, voting districts. And so that is how certain people just like continue to be people who don't represent the interests of their district, of like the people in the state, just continue to be elected and hold this up at every opportunity. So I think that it's a mixture of both of those things. And I also think that people are exhausted, and they're so accustomed to this happening that there's become a sense of cynicism and futility. It occurred to me as well the other day, you know, on April 17th, there was another mass shooting at Florida State University. And that was committed by a young man whose mother was a law enforcement official. And you know, that has already vanished completely. It's already vanished completely from the news. It's gone. I don't remember the last time that I read a story about it. It was less than a month. It was less than a month ago. And it explodes into public consciousness for a few days, and then it just, you know, and then it just vanishes. So yeah, I think that there are so many things that contribute, you know, to this. And the last thing that I'll just say, you know, when I first came to South Africa in 2007 on my with a Fulbright group, you know, the ostensible purpose of that visit for that was a month in South Africa, was to look at the different ways that educational institutions were attempting to mitigate the impact of apartheid in education. And so to me, the first time that I had ever been to Africa, anywhere, I thought, okay, that makes sense. But then even, after that month, I realized, oh, you can't separate this. You cannot answer that question about education and inequity without also pulling on misogyny, HIV, physical violence, housing, geography, a million other different things. You pulled on one thread and the entire thing unraveled. And I think the same is true with firearm violence in this country. And it is not merely about guns. And I can see that there's a question coming up about this as well, that you cannot talk about firearms in this country without also talking about freedom, safety, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a real American. The defense of being in defense against tyranny, and all of those different kinds of things. So it has its tentacles in a million other arenas, and that makes it so intractable and so difficult to address.
Thanks, Megan. Can you see Layla's question?
Yeah. Yes.
She's asking a question about what we discussed previously.
Yes.
About the genocide against white people, and wants you to reflect on the notion of truth, please.
Yeah. Layla, that is an excellent question, and it is very disorienting to live here right now, and to be subject to these million conflicting accounts of factual truth and narrative truth, many of which come from, the highest levels of the government. And I think that for me, yes, it does continue to bring on a continued urgency about this issue. But I also think that it's such an onslaught against factual truth from so many different directions that it's making it very difficult to know where to turn one's attention. Like, do we need to focus on the truths of vaccine preventable illness? Do we need to focus on the truths about firearm violence? Do we need to focus on the truths about immigration? I think those of us who are trying to pay attention and who are trying to write and lobby and all of these things, our attention is diminished. It's kind of, it's sprinkled because there are so many different places that demand our attention and demand a seizing of that narrative, to redirect that. I think it's so difficult right now because everything feels urgent. That's probably a really unsatisfactory answer. But I hope that that's a little bit, I hope that that's a little bit helpful.
Megan, then there's a question from Japheth. I hope I pronounced the name correctly, please.
Yeah. So do you think there are meaningful parallels between gun violence in the US and South Africa? And to what extent do the histories of racialized inequality, masculinities, and state complicity shape the patterns and meanings of gun violence in both the United States and South Africa, and what parallels can be drawn? How much time do we have? I would love to talk about this and endlessly. I'm going to focus briefly on masculinities, because that has been an area that I've been quite focused on. And I think that, again, in many pockets of American culture, masculinity is deeply tied, inextricably tied with the ability to commit violence and to threaten violence. And I speak about this in my book to some extent. And For example, one of the things that I learned as I was, when I began writing, when I was doing some of my initial research at UFS, is that the vast majority of school shooters, for example, are men and boys. And they're not exclusively, but largely white men and boys. So that strikes me as a pretty salient characteristic that might need to be looked at, because I'm quite certain that if all of those mass murders were being perpetrated by girls and women, we would be having a robust cultural conversation about what was wrong with girls and women, that they felt the need to enact their anger in this way. Now that has changed, I think, over the last 10 years or so, that commonality, the masculine element of firearm violence is becoming more, prominent. People are understanding that better. But, the majority of people who commit suicide with firearms in the United States are also men. And there have been some really interesting community efforts to try to mitigate that, especially in some rural communities where firearm ownership is extremely common, and where, a masculine ethos of stoicism and independence and, sort of uncommunicativeness is common. And those community efforts have seen some good results to help men understand that if you're dealing with a mental health crisis, maybe it's okay to give your guns to this other person, to take them for a little while, so that you're not at risk. But I have seen, men interviewed in some of these articles who have said, if I don't have my guns, what kind of a man am I? If I don't have this means to protect myself and my family, then what kind of man am I? And I think that that's just such a tragic response. That the only way that they can think about themselves as a man and a protector is to have the capacity for lethal violence. And so I think that there has to be, again, such a wide, deep conversation among men in particular about what it really means to be a man. And if being able to be a protector is such an important part of that, how do you do that? Can you do that without your guns? Because those guns in your home, by all the data we have, those guns in the home endanger everyone. They make it much more likely that people in the home will die from accidents, from suicide, and from homicide. Like, that is all the data we have indicates that. So I hope, and I know, like I said, I know that this is happening on, in smaller levels, that men are having those conversations and thinking about what that means. So.
Thank you, Megan. There's a question from Tinus.
Yeah.
Thanks again. The problem with having a conversation with you, Megan, is that I have one question in my head and then I listen to you and then you generate 5 more. So it's going to be difficult. I'm going to try and control myself and limit myself to one question. So I want to get your take on one concept and one phenomenon. Okay. So a concept that I recently encountered from my research buddy in Texas, in San Antonio, that I'm writing with, is he's using a word called alethophobia, which is I'll type it out down here. Aletho, I can spell phobia. Alethophobia. I think I got it right. Now that has to do with the fear of admitting that you are a member of a social identity group that is wrong. And this makes me wonder about Layla's question about the Trump distortion of truth. And I'm wondering about why those distortions of truth are finding such a wide audience, why it has definitely taken root amongst men. It also makes me think about what you mentioned about masculinity in crisis and the emergence of, the red pill society and how that intersects with gun violence. So that's my question is for you is, do you think that's part of the problem, that when we talk about gun violence, that is what a lot of supporters of gun ownership hear is not a conversation about guns. They are hearing you say men are bad. They are hearing you say, when you talk about toxic masculinity, they are hearing you criticize men. And in their own heads, they immediately go into defense mode. They immediately say, well, that's you critical race theorists and critical feminists telling me to not be a man, when for a fact I know that women out there want a man who can inflict violence. That's what my red pill buddies tell me. I'm a single dude in the basement playing video games all day because I can't get a job, but I know that girls want a guy who can inflict harm. That's the society. And I cannot talk about gun violence because that means it's just another way in which you people are telling me that I'm a bad person, part of a bad social group and part of a bad country. Could you theorize that and think through that with us, please?
Yes. Thank you. I do not, thank you for teaching me that new word. Thank your colleague for that. So I have, one of the things that I also read a lot about are cultures of honor and cultures of dignity. And that varies so much, even from region to region in the United States. The United States is just such a massive country, and the sort of norms and cultures vary so much from state to state and region to region. But particularly in Appalachia and in the broader sort of South, where I suppose that where I live now, honor culture is deeply embedded. And I think that probably goes all the way back to, some of the original, European settlers in this area who came from, the borderlands of Scotland and Ireland. But the idea that you would turn away from a fight, that you would walk away from conflict, is just anathema. Like that wouldn't happen. And the southern states have some of the most lax laws about firearms. There are greater incidences of firearm violence. The region of Virginia where I stay, that's in the sort of the far southwest part of the state, the most rural part of the state, leads the state in firearm suicide. And so I think that the attachment to this honor culture and the insistence on saving face is killing people. It's killing a lot of men in particular. And I genuinely don't know how to break through that. I don't know how to dampen the idea that there's nothing wrong with saying that you didn't understand, or that you made a mistake, or that the way that you have always done something up until now is harmful. But I think that to me, that is a huge part of this, that so many of us are so resistant to the idea of admitting that we might have gotten something wrong. And that, I think, again, if I'm continuing with this whole idea of pulling on threads, that ties so deeply into American exceptionalism. Like, everyone wants to be like us, right? So why would we ever admit that we've gotten something wrong? Other countries have gotten stuff wrong. We have only ever done things, we've only ever done things right. And I think, again, it's hard for people who haven't grown up here to understand how much that is embedded in you from the time you start school. That if it were up to any other person anywhere in the world, they would come here. Everybody wants to come here. this is the greatest country. Our presidents say this, not just the current one. They all say this, that this is the greatest country in the history of the world. Well, when that's what you hear from all of your elected officials, why would anyone think that you have to learn or say, maybe this doesn't work for us so much anymore. Maybe we're dying for the sake of this honor code, and maybe that's not worth it anymore. So that's probably a really unsatisfactory answer, but I think that it's tied in so deeply to this honor culture that is so rooted here, and the fear of losing face.
Thank you, Megan. Any other questions before, if I may ask you a quick question, please?
Yeah.
Could you just say something about how does reframing firearm violence from a public health issue to a justice issue challenge dominant narratives around resilience and personal recovery? And what implications do you think this would have for collective responsibility and policy making, if any? Thank you.
Yeah. I think I want to say that I think reframing it, there's nothing wrong with having reframed it as a public health issue, because that does sort of remove it from the realm of rights, which I think is what people get really fixated on. No one wants to be against health. You know, we can have different conversations and heated conversations about rights, but health, one would hope, is something that everyone can agree on. However, again, firearm violence, I think, is it's a contradictory phenomenon in that in some ways no one is safe from it here. As I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, you know, a member of Congress, Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, was at an event in her state in Arizona that she represented, and she was shot in the head in a mass shooting. And her husband is now a senator. So this can happen to members of Congress. It can happen to people, to, you know, kids in a school in Texas. It can happen to people going to a concert in Nevada. It can happen wherever. That being said, there are, you know, members of the population that are at greater risk. And I would hope that we want justice to extend to everyone. And that we can honor people's experiences. Like Mia Serio said, by making sure that this doesn't happen again, that is what real justice would look like, to ensure that we learn from other people's experiences and use that to make a better world, to make a better country for all of these children, and for every parent and every educator and every just random every citizen. And like I said, I think when the demand for resilience is put only on people, there's no impetus for legislators to do anything. You know, you just have to get thoughts and prayers. You have to just get over this. What is that? They have no responsibility when it's just on an individual to deal with it. So
Exactly. Thank you.
Learn anything. So yeah.
Megan, thank you ever so much for a fascinating talk.
Oh,
and
thank
thank
you
again for honoring us with your presence. It was
Oh,
so
gosh.
lovely to see you and to meet your husband. And I hope we can do this again soon, please.
Yes, I would love that. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. It's such a joy. I'm just honored beyond belief. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Megan, and good luck over there.
Thank
With
you.
an orange
Yes.
lollipop.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you, Megan and Johan, and thank you, Marisa, so much for
Yes, thank you, Marisa and Hunter, for
moderating
organizing.
the session. It's much appreciated. Thank
Yes.
It's a huge pleasure. And go well, everybody.
Thank
Yes.
We'll
you.
speak
Thanks
soon.
everyone for attending. I'll send the link to the recording in the next few hours.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
All right,
everybody.
have a wonderful rest of your day. Good
Thank
weekend.
you.
Thank you. You
Bye,
too.
guys.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.